Normally when I review a game, I don't look around at what other people are saying about it to try to keep my analysis as pure as possible, except if I'm doing meta-analysis of IGN, and that is actually a factor of my own analysis. But outside of that, I don't usually look around at what other people are saying about a game that I'm going to review, because I will indirectly or directly probably start to respond to their responses, and you get that kind of building on building on building of critique type of stuff. And I've learned, hey, to keep the analysis as clean and fundamental as possible, I'm just gonna put up blinders and just fire off what I say. But I've made a very big exception here in the case of Cygni, because for one, I actually have a bit of a backstory about the game, so I know a lot about the game to begin with, but also because I wanted to see what other people would say about the game outside of my own influence, because I have a very prominent and, robust viewpoint about the genre. It's the foundation of this channel. Of course, I'm going to have a lot of things to say about Cygni, but I wanted to see, well, It's a Wonderful Life. What if there is no Electric Underground? What would you guys say? What would you guys make of this game if I wasn't around? And it's been very interesting experience to kind of sit back and watch other people's reviews, go through their comments. And what I found was very interesting is that a lot of the reviews and critiques, maybe directly or indirectly, kind of were anticipating a lot of things that I would probably say. And I even noticed in comment sections of other people's channels and reviews, like people getting mad at me before I've even said anything, which I think is actually kind of a good sign. It's kind of a sign that people feel like something is off about this game, and they also feel like, well, if some person is going to come in and say what's off about this game, it's probably going to be Mark with the Electric Underground. So it's funny just to kind of witness that. But what I've learned in this experience, and it's not really a happy lesson, but it's a lesson I think that's very important, is that if you present the gaming public and gaming journalists at large with a narrative up front, you kind of give them a framing of your game before they play it, before they get their hands on it, then that is actually a very effective and powerful tool, whether it is calculated or not. I don't know if it's, the level of calculation is always interesting to try to figure out, but whether it's calculated or not, whether it's organic or not, if you give game journalists, the gaming public, reviewers, the content creators, kind of something to talk about before the game's even in their hands, that is an incredibly powerful tool, because that narrative, that discussion of the game will clog up and push out a lot of the more foundational critiques of your game. We saw this with Stellar Blade. I think we're going to see this a little bit with Phantom Blade Zero, and we're seeing it now with Cygni. Now, Stellar Blade had like a very powerful narrative because it was political. Go look at the comments section of my review. People are just fired up about all these big narratives and concepts, and the actual game itself, the actual execution, design, fundamentals of the gameplay, don't really need to worry about that. There's only so much you can actually communicate about a game to the public. And so what reviewers naturally do eventually, whether directly or indirectly, is you start to choose a thesis and highlight around your review. What are you talking about with this game? And so this is important. It seems all abstract, but it's very important, because if you are a publisher, if you are a marketer, if you are putting your game out there, if you can direct what you want people to say about your game right up front, then you can create this whole framework from which your game can now be viewed. And through that framework, you can get much more charitable readings, or just blocking out of some of the more foundational issues, problems, the meat and potatoes, because people get way more excited around narratives and meta narratives than they do the boring, mundane level design, controls, performance, that type of analysis. That is a lot less hot and sexy than analysis that's all about saving the genre or redefining the genre. Game journalists, game reviewers, YouTubers, myself, it's very fun and exciting to jump into these topics and be like, yeah, redefining the genre, meta-analysis. In that whole melee, you can sneak by a lot of problems, just slip it right past everyone's radars, because everyone's start fighting amongst each other, and you get hardcore versus the casuals. You get this whole maelstrom going on around your game. Saw the Stellar Blade, and you can just slide past with a lot of bad design. You can just slip that design right past everyone because it's more interesting and exciting to talk about all these sort of meta big concepts. And I think Cygni either knows this or luck has been very kind to them, because if you look around at the reviews, it's actually shocking. I'm honestly saying this. It's actually shocking how positively this game has been reviewed. And I know like game journalists and the gaming press, I've talked about this a lot, are not the most refined palates when it comes to shmups, but we are seeing really positive review scores for this game, which brings me to the second thing I want to talk about, and then we'll get into the real meat of it, which is my backstory, my history with Cygni, because I was actually aware of Cygni a lot longer than the general gaming public. I think I was aware of Cygni before it was even picked up by Konami. I mean, all the way back then, because the dev team, or some members of the dev team, were fans of my podcast and fans about my discussions around the genre and stuff like that. And so I was communicating with the dev team in the early stages quite a bit. And then the development progressed without me from that point forward. And what I was talking to the dev team a lot about in the very early stages of this game, kind of stage 1 area, is just the basic foundational concepts around the game. I talked to them so much about the movement, the acceleration, the aspect ratio, the ship size, the kind of just general structure and framework for the game. Because I remember there was one day where I was just so passionate about the ship movement of this game that I was working at my shitty desk job at the time. I clocked out of my shitty desk job in the middle of the day. I walked down to the park. I sat under a tree with my phone at the park and gave them Mark's sermon that lasted probably 2 hours about the issue with the movement inertia of the game, because the initial build of the game had Euro shmup inertia. I gave them this rousing 2-hour speech about all the problems it was going to cause, not only now, but in the future, and the domino effect of how if you don't set up the foundation of your game up front, it's just going to domino into continual problems all the way throughout. And then you can't go back and revise it, because if you make 5 stages with flawed design, you can't go back and revive those 5. I mean, you could, but Konami's not going to let you do that. You're not going to have the budget and time to do that. It'd be like shooting a film and shooting 4 months worth of footage and then being like, oh, this guy's a terrible actor. We need to recast and reshoot the film. That's what I'm saying. You want to nail all this stuff right up front. And what ended up happening is just hey, they had to progress onward, and we never really fully saw eye to eye on a lot of this stuff, because a lot of this stuff I was critiquing, it is still here in shockingly similar form all these years later. And I bring this up because I want to clarify something, a misunderstanding that I think the general shmup audience and gaming audience has about the Electric Underground, and it's personified here with Cygni, which is that I am not some kind of genre fundamentalist. I'm not a cartoon character where if you present me with a Western-made shmup, I'm just going to reject it on that basis, or I'm just going to reject it because it doesn't exactly play like Dodonpachi and Crimson Clover and all these arcade classics of the past. But I think the standing lesson we can learn from Cygni is that if you want to innovate arcade game design or traditional game design and bring it to a modern audience, this idea, this concept isn't something I'm going to fundamentally reject. I think it is actually a very noble and great goal. But the problem is that you are actually taking on a higher burden of responsibility with your design, not a lower burden. And I think this is what has happened here, is that this sort of, hey, we're going to take shmups and bring them to a casual mainstream audience. This has been kind of like a get out of jail free card for the game in its reviews. But if you want to innovate a genre, if you want to take a genre into a new direction, to a new audience, you have to build such a strong foundation that is breaking off from the traditional path. Those innovations need to be fundamentally rock solid. And this is where the comparison with Treasure I've seen in reviews really falls apart, because Treasure is the developer that has done this right in a lot of cases, where Cygni has not. What Treasure has done, if you look at their games, is they have the fundamentals. They have the understanding and foundation of what makes this genre work, what makes just action game design generally work. Forget shmups, just general action game design. What does that look like? What makes that strong? What makes that compelling? What makes that replayable? What makes that hold up under pressure? All these kinds of concepts Treasure really understood. They were experts of. They had a strong foundation there, and then they built upon it, like Ikaruga. Ikaruga is doing something that is genuinely very innovative for shmups. It's inverting this whole thing of not only are you dodging bullets, but you're also absorbing them. And in that concept, what Treasure had to do is build up this whole robust, well-tested, balanced polarity system. This is why other games cannot match Ikaruga's polarity system, because other games look at the polarity system and they say, oh, okay, so you just absorb bullets. Okay, so let's put the game and then you absorb the bullets. Got it. No. The polarity system has way more going on with that, and it links into the chaining system, which links into the level design, which links into the enemy design, which links into the controls. Game design is a whole network of decisions. You can't just take one concept, throw it in there, and then be like, it works. That's not how strong action game design works, whether it's a shmup or not a shmup. And so with my review of Cygni, I think a lot of people are expecting me just to sit here and go, it's not a traditional shmup because of this. I understand the philosophy and concept around the game. I've heard it directly from the developers multiple times. Okay, we do not want to make a traditional shmup. I get that. We want to make a shmup that mainstream people will connect with and get into. I get that. But if you're going to do that, the game has to be well developed. This is an expert level project. This isn't a beginner level project. I think that's where Cygni really got tripped up, is they came into this brand new, haven't made a game before, haven't made a game of this scale before, coming in, big studio, all eyes are on you, can you deliver? And then with this big ambition and not the experience to back it up, it's gonna be a mess because you can't learn on the job at this scale. So I wanted to talk about all that, speaking of eating up bandwidth, but now let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's get technical with it. Let's begin by talking about the performance issues, because I've been very surprised how much Cygni has been able to slide by in terms of its performance, especially because the one thing mainstream critics tend to be sticklers about is performance issues. Digital Foundry made an entire brand of critique based off of this style of feedback, and so I was expecting, well, with all these problems with Cygni, I'm sure it's going to get clobbered by that metric alone. But no, it seemed to have been able to slide by maybe a little bit like, yeah, there's just some performance problems here and there, but it's quite severe, to be honest. I have a pretty high-end gaming PC. It's not the top of the top end, but it plays all current gen stuff coming out right now. No problem at all. And yet I cannot perform on Cygni in a really solid, consistent way without turning down the settings to like Steam Deck levels. And even then, when I get that low, you'll still see in the footage here, hiccups, problems. And I think the reason for this actually goes back to bad programming. I do not think you can make the excuse of, well, if you want top-end graphics and top-end visual presentation, then this is the cost of it. I don't think so. Not these days. No, hardware is a lot more optimized these days. There's really no technical reason why Cygni shouldn't be able to run really well on a top-end gaming PC. I'm not an expert in this field, but I suspect it has to do with the program. There are some signs of this. First of all, just bad shmup design is that when the enemies go off screen, they continue to fire at you. That's a huge no-no in shmup design. But even outside of that, it's also a bad sign in terms of the programming of the game, because you're wondering, are these enemies still active when they're not on screen? Is the game trying to run the AI for a bunch of different enemies while they're off screen? Or what about when they're coming on screen, before they're on screen? What's going on there? And I do think there is some solid connection here, because if you go and play on hard mode, you'll notice that because in hard mode the enemies shoot more often, you'll notice, oh, there's more hardware problems, there's more slowdown, there's more issues. So I do think it comes back to the actual programming. And like I said earlier in the review, you need to get this stuff all nailed down right up front, because the further you get into the game design and you just kind of try to blanket over it, bandage over it with just keep throwing higher spec hardware at it, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And how are you going to fix it? At this point, going back and fixing all of these performance issues in the game, I think would be a hell of an undertaking. I don't think it'd be a weekend of work. I think it would be a lot of programming. That's my suspicion. I could be proven wrong. I'd be happy to be proven wrong. But yeah, the performance of this game as it is right now is a real problem. And I would say if you don't have a high-end gaming PC, I'm assuming it's running okay on the PS5 or PS5, then I can't recommend the game just on that basis alone. And I'm not a huge stickler on performance, believe me, I barely ever bring it up in my reviews. But in the case of Cygni, it is actually a problem that conflicts with the general concept of the game. Where the general concept of the game, as I understand, is to be a mainstream shmup that the casual audience can pick up and get into, and maybe from there that interest can trickle down to the rest of the genre. But the problem with this idea, just from technical requirements, is, well, this casual audience are going to need hardcore levels of hardware, or they're going to need to be on PS5s. And if we've looked at the PS5 demographic for stuff, it's a niche now. The days of everyone having a PlayStation 4, the days of everyone having a console, those days are over. These days, if you want a casually accessible game, it needs to be on everything and it needs to run well on everything. And then we have the controls and the aspect ratio. Both of these things I gave a lot of direct feedback to the developers about. The first issue is, of course, the ship movement. I said if you don't get this ship movement right away, it's going to domino for the rest of these next few years. It's going to build on itself, because how you interact with everything, how you balance the enemies, how you balance the patterns, how you balance the levels, how you balance the bosses, everything will be balanced around the player's movement. So this movement needs to be nailed in. In the initial versions that I played, there was a lot of like traditional Euro shmup inertia. And the problem with having inertia in a shmup, I have a whole video about this if you want to hear it, but in a nutshell, the problem with having inertia in a shmup is that shmups are all about precise movement. That is the core way you interface with the game. Inertia creates a non-interactive barrier to this precision that is outside of the player's control. You can try to compensate for the inertia, but that's not the same thing as controlling the inertia, interacting with inertia. And so this is the difference between having inertia in a racing game and having inertia in a shmup. In a shmup, inertia is just a passive barrier that you just have to deal with. You cannot get around it, you can't control it. Where in a racing game, you have brakes, you have all these different controls and mechanics and systems to harness the inertia and use it as a gameplay mechanic. In shmups, it's just an artificial barrier gunking up the rest of the game's mechanics. It prevents you from doing things as a developer. It prevents your patterns from being too precise. You can't push the player's movement mechanics to a certain extent because they literally lack the precision to react to it, but it doesn't give you anything. There's nothing you do with inertia in this fashion that you can't do without inertia and can't do better without it. So it's a barrier, but it doesn't add anything. And so I was able to get them to drop the inertia, but there was one mechanic they were obsessed with, and it persists to the final version here, which is acceleration. So you have half inertia. You don't have the last part, but you have the beginning part where you have to speed up to reach top speed. And the reason why they have this kind of acceleration is because the aspect ratio is so huge. They feel, okay, we need to have this sort of speeding up thing to get you to be able to move around the screen. But the problem with that is that creates a very ugly incentive structure in terms of movement, which is circle-strafing. So when it comes to 16:9 aspect ratio, as a shmup developer, your greatest enemy that you have to keep an eye out for is circle-strafing. Because since you have so much lateral space and so much compressed vertical space, the circle strafe becomes a very powerful tool. This is why all twin sticks struggle with this, where you can just fly in circles, and the game can't really catch up with the player if you're flying in circles. And if you have acceleration, where you are more reliable at top speed than you are moving in little bursts as you normally do in shmups, then the entire meta of the game, movement-wise, is fly in circles. Just fly in these big circles, little circles, big circles, little circles, back and forth, constantly moving, sliding around. What I suggested that they do is, instead of doing this sort of weird acceleration to reach top speeds to get around the screen, what they should do is something that Dranius does, a fellow 16:9 shmup actually, is have a speed shift system where your speed is constant, but you can change the gear of your speed essentially. So if you want maximum speed, you flip up to maximum speed and you can zoom around the screen, fly in circles all you want. And then if you want more precise speed for the tighter patterns, you shift down into this precise dodging mode. And what's funny is they kind of heard this bit of feedback a little bit, but they didn't go all the way with it, because if you go into the options menu of the game, yes, options menu, you can find kind of a vestigial tail of that concept where you can change the ship speed, or ship sensitivity as it's called. And so hilariously, if you want to move precisely in this game, or as precisely as you can, the method I found is, as you're playing, you literally pause the game and change the sensitivity, where you've got a section where you're doing a lot of circle strafing, which is most of the stages. You flip that up to 6, circle strafe your life away. Then you get into the boss fights, or like a mid-boss or whatever. Pause, down, 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 shift to 1, and now you're trying to play precisely there. The concept could have worked if they just integrated it into the game a lot better. First of all, instead of having this stupid, like, speeding up out of nowhere mechanic, what they should have done, especially since they seem obsessed with you playing on the controller, you can't even play this on arcade stick. They want you to play on a PS5 pad or whatever, Xbox pad or whatever. What they should have done is mapped true analog movement to the ship, so that when you're on the left stick, it just maps purely like true analog movement, like you're playing Elden Ring or Dark Souls or modern action games now, where you have analog movement with the left stick. They should have added true analog movement to the left stick. If you want to feel what this feels like, Gunvein actually has this, and it's a lot more precise and reliable than the typical analog to digital sort of conversion that most shmups use that feels like garbage. If you're playing with true analog mapping in a shmup, it's actually really cool and would have fit Cygni perfectly, especially since they want you to use the right stick to aim. It's almost like they want a twin stick shooter, but basically you've got the right stick for aiming, you've got the left stick with true analog mapping, and then you could have a gear system. So you press like L1 or L2 and it could have geared up and down. So then as you're going through the stages, you could be firing and then gearing up and down and having a lot more precise, a lot more natural feeling movement with this system. Again, we're seeing constant compromise with this game's vision, where it's kind of got the idea, but the idea isn't fully developed. It's just like, yeah, close enough. Same thing with the aspect ratio, actually. So the game has to be 16:9 vertical. That is what it wants. That is what has to happen. I get it. Thing is that even with this basis of let's make it a 16:9 vertical, the devil's aspect ratio, as I call it, like the ultimate evil of aspect ratios of shmup design is the 16:9 vertical, because it completely shifts the dynamic of the gameplay, because you've got all this lateral space and no vertical space, where shmups traditionally, lots of vertical space, not a lot of lateral space, you see? So it's a complete inversion of the aspect ratio, but you're still moving upward rather than horizontally. Well, you can attempt to sort of compensate for this problem, and there's ways to do this. Cygni did not do any of them. What you can do, and I suggested this, but it happened, is first of all, scale things up. Make stuff bigger, because you got all this fat, wide space. Just make things fat and wide. That's a way to compensate for this aspect ratio. And some shmups are picking up on this, like Grand Cross Renovation does a great job of this. Like also the weapon system, you can aim it more. So ironically, the weapon aiming of Cygni is too limited. It actually should have been even wider. You should be able to whip that all the way across the screen sideways. And then they should have made the enemies much bigger. Your ship needs to be like 10 times bigger. You're basically flying this little hitbox with meters around it. Why don't you make the ship bigger and use a small hitbox like every bullet hell shmup ever figured out? Look at Battle Traverse. Battle Traverse has this giant character sprite, but you can see the hitbox and it plays super well. Cygni took the worst approach possible by making the player tiny, by making the bullets tiny, by making most of the enemies tiny. Everything is tiny. And so then, in order to compensate this, they need to just fill the screen with so much enemies and bullets, and I'm sure that's impacting hardware performance, where instead of having 200 enemies on screen all shooting tiny little objects at you, why not have 15, 20 enemies on screen that are big, shooting big objects at you? That would probably help the performance, but it would also just make the game more coherent and less crazy and more consistent and just better, right? Make things bigger, scale up. If you're going to use this giant aspect ratio, make things enormous. It also makes the game feel very empty, and this isn't just me. I noticed in a lot of the comments around the game and other people's videos, the game feels empty. And that's because it actually is. Nothing is that persistent on the screen, which you need. You need something persistent and big breaking up the flow of the game, because check out Bog's shmup design video on this. It's really good. You want persistent big objects hanging out, shepherding and moving the player and create natural paths through the level. Cygni does not have this very much, and the few places that it does definitely stand out, like stage 5, that stands out, and then the beginning of stage 3, where you're on the rail section and it's like speeding along, that stands out as like, oh, this is kind of a good idea, because you're having to now move around the screen, you're getting boxed in, there's things persisting on the screen, that kind of stuff. They could have done that through the enemy design, through the bullet design, just generally. That was really lacking, because what ends up happening with Cygni is all the gameplay mushes together. We'll talk about the level design now, because all the stages blend with one another. And even if you get a few sections in the stages, like the opening of stage 2, where you have all those things on the side you have to deal with, like, oh, okay, that's kind of a memorable section. But as soon as you get out of that section and just into the open fields section of the level, in the open field sections of most of the game, it's just the same thing repeated over and over. And I'll give you the exact formula, which is that you just strafe, strafe, strafe. Don't worry about taking hits, because everything's aimed at you. Just move around things in big circles or little circles or C's. Just spin, 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 circle, circle, circle. And I was pointing out this problem to the developers in the playtesting stage, that they weren't thrilled with this feedback. But what I did was, in stage 1, I just flew in a circle the entire time. And I said, look how much I am getting away with just flying in a circle over and over and over. And that was before there's homing weapons. Now you have homing, you have the shield. You're good to go, baby. Turn on homing, turn on the shield, aim the stick a little bit, and you're just all the way through the game to the end. It's wild. And this all ties back to the movement and enemy design. Like I said, they're all dominoes building on top of each other, to the point now where trying to traditionally play the game is stupid, especially because everything is aimed at you. There's hardly any static attacks. So all you need to do to circumvent a lot of the bullets and attacks is just keep going in a circle. And I think because they ran into time constraints, or they didn't want to, revise, or they wanted to extend the length of the stages, it just repeats the same patterns too. What they could have done is just gone in with a scalpel and chopped out the little unique chunks of each stage and then strung them together into a 30-minute, 35-minute run, something like that, and would have had a much stronger game in terms of the level design. The way it just repeats on and on ad nauseum is detrimental to the better portions of the game, because if you ever find sections of a level that are interesting, or maybe a boss fight that's interesting, you have to pay the tax of going through all of these repetitive, lame areas in order to get to them, especially because the only thing you truly are routing in this game are the item drops, which brings us to the shield system. On the channel, there's a topic I've been talking about a little bit, which is natural game balance versus artificial game balance. This applies to shmups, but it applies to pretty much all action games. And what natural game balance is is balancing the gameplay, the enemies, the levels, the level design, the interactions around the core concept of avoiding enemy hitboxes and hitting them with your own hitboxes. This is the core basis of all action game design, whether it's shmups, whether it's fighting games, running guns, Dark Souls, whatever. Avoiding enemy hitboxes and hitting them with your hitbox. That is natural game balance, which should be the core emphasis of your enemy interactions. And then on top of that, you have artificial balance. And this is where you bring in additional resources or traditional rules that lay over the top of the natural game balance. And yes, many great games have a mixture of natural balance at their core and then artificial balance layering over the top of it. But the problem that we see with a lot of modern game design, or just poor game design, is when the artificial layer sitting over the top of the natural game balance start to override it to the point where the natural skill set of avoiding enemy hitboxes and hitting them with your own hitboxes is no longer the core skill of the game, in that the core skill of the game becomes managing the artificial systems. And this is where Cygni finds itself because of the shield system and because of the just poor general balance of the game. And I've heard some people talking about how this is like subversive, or it's like taking the genre convention in this sort of meta way and flipping it on its head. But that is not the case of what Cygni is doing. Cygni is not doing anything subversive because it is not through its systems or through its design actually encouraging you to get hit. This is where Ikaruga and it are extremely different. The polarity system of Ikaruga encourages and rewards you to take certain hits and avoid other hits, and then you can switch those on the fly by switching polarity. And so there is still a natural balance. When you're black, you have to avoid white. When you're white, you have to avoid black. That natural balance is still maintained. It's just you're able to switch which is which on the fly in a really cool way. Cygni does nothing like this. You don't actually get rewarded for taking hits. It is a strip of duct tape over poorly balanced design, because optimal gameplay of Cygni does not involve getting hit systematically. There's not a core set of mechanics that are like, yeah, get hit. This is where Graze Counter and Drainius and a lot of these like bullet absorbing games differ, because those games actually have systems that encourage you to play in that style. Cygni isn't wanting you to tank hits. It isn't wanting you to get hit, but it is allowing you through the shield resource system to do that in the balance, where in the end, because of the balance of the shield system, yes, playing this way is the best, simplest way to play the game, but that's only because of poor balance, not because of systematic design. And there's a really easy test for this. What happens when you take away the artificial layer of the game? So in Ikaruga, the polarity system is not artificial, but the meter you build while eating bullets, that is an artificial layer. So you take away the release power meter, right? So you don't have meter. And then in Cygni, you take away the shield system. Which game holds up better? Does Ikaruga play a little bit better with the meter in the game? Yeah, it does. But does it fundamentally fall apart and explode? No, it still functions very, very well. Even if you never use release power, you never use meter, you just use your shots and polarity, the game runs perfectly fine. In the case of Cygni, though, if you take away this shield system, you take away the items that drop, which do happen on different difficulties, you notice, oh, the flaws of the enemy and level design become abundantly clear. It becomes very obvious how chaotic and poorly implemented the base layer of the game is. And that is not the type of design that you want to see in a shmup, even a so-called like subversive shmup, because you're not subverting anything. There's nowhere to go from here. So the item drop becomes the core mechanic of the game. It is the key. It is the focus. It is the main determining factor of what makes the game easy or hard. That is not what you want to see in terms of core game balance, because none of the other aspects of the game matter anymore. For example, earlier I said, yeah, some of the enemies fire at you from off screen, but that's fine because you have the shield system. Some of the enemies spawn in and just nail you out of nowhere. That's fine. You've got the shield system. There's so many problems with the general basic gameplay and game balance, but you can just functionally override them by just feeding the player health and feeding the player item pickups. And so the meta of this game is not transferable to shmups at all. It's not even transferable to twin stick shooters. It's not really transferable to anywhere because the whole point is simply delay the item pickups and convert them to missiles when it matters and don't convert them to missiles when it's risky. Like, that is the whole route of the game. That is the core of this game. When you're learning and routing it, what you're concentrating on is, can I pick up the item yet? Do I delay it? Do I convert it to a missile? Do I wait to convert it to a missile? And it's really not that interesting in the end once you figure out kind of how it works. And you'll see throughout all my footage here, me just doing that constantly. And I'm cruising through the game. And what's sad is that game critics only seem to care if it technically functions. And you'll notice as you're playing back-to-back runs how random the experience ends up feeling, because a lot of what makes your run good or not is kind of outside of your hands in a lot of ways. Like, you can play the same general strategy through a section, and based off of the RNG of if the item drops here or there, or what your missiles decide to do, you could get a perfect run through, or you're barely scooting through, or you'll get overwhelmed and died if your missiles decide not to go where they need to go. Like, so much of this game is out of the player's control, especially the missile behavior. What the missiles kind of decide to do is a lot of the times outside of your hand. You can control, of course, the missile firing rate when you fire them, but the missiles come out of your ship at like these weird angles, and they don't care what you're up to. They kind of just do their own thing. For example, if you're targeted on to a lower enemy, the missiles will fly at that lower enemy if there's not other stuff on screen, but there's often lots of other stuff on screen. So you're targeting the lower enemy, you're firing your missile, and the missile just decides, nah, I'm just gonna chase after these random popcorn. Or you have a giant cluster of popcorn flowing in from certain sections of the stage, and you want to nail them with the missile to get more items. And so you're like pointing as much as you can your ship at this oncoming swarm, but you can't actually tell the missiles to go there. So sometimes they'll go there and hit it, and it's like, oh, jackpot. And other times the missile's like, nah, we're gonna fly to the corner of the screen and blow up dudes on the corner of the screen. Like, the fact that they don't give you precise control over where these missiles go, you're just kind of firing in the dark. The routing of this game is hilarious once you understand how to play it. It's all about like this vague timing of when you fire the missiles, and then routing health drops, and then like making sure like you get a bunch of health items on screen. You kind of just leave them there, fire through the missiles, then kind of sweep up, convert to missiles, sweep up, convert to missiles, and you do this sort of little rationing of the health items while you leave them on screen and convert them into missiles. And then you learn, oh, this section coming up here, missiles are kind of useless, so don't fire missiles here, just stick in the corner with homing. So yeah, Cygni's shield system is not some clever inversion of the genre, breaking the rules and that type of thing. What it is a band-aid over not having to balance fundamentally poorly designed combat encounters. I am looking at my list of topics to cover here, including the boss fights and the fake progression system, and it will just go on and on and on. It is quite exhaustive how many things you could say about this game in terms of needing to be improved. So I'll touch on the boss fights a little bit and the progression system a little bit, but then we gotta wrap this up because I don't want to turn this into a giant video essay. So the boss fights are very good looking visually, and you can see that a lot of effort was taken into making the boss fights look good. But if you take out just the visual presentation of the fights, these boss fights are incredibly basic, and there's a lot of time that you spend just looking at the boss do stuff. You're sitting there, oh, isn't that a cool animation? Ooh, that's cool. And my theory about this is that the reason why the boss fights of this game are so basic outside of the visual presentation is that making them more varied having more patterns, having more animations, having things that you can break, destructible parts, all that sort of stuff would have required more time and more budget. So they're the case of you're getting more upfront visually, but you're definitely paying in the gameplay variety part, which makes the ends of the stages really anticlimactic. It's messed up how much time it takes to finally get to the boss of each stage, and then how little the bosses end up doing. You can tell when you beat the boss, especially because of how protracted the stages are, that there should be more. Like, you're kind of surprised when the bosses end. You're like, all right, we're finally kind of getting warmed up, we're kind of getting going, and then it ends. And it's wild that this game has no boss fight mode or no boss select, considering how long the stages are. And I think this translates over to the boss balance, because if the bosses were more nasty and more aggressive, then having to play a bunch of time to get back to them over and over would be ridiculously punishing. And so by not having a boss select and by having the stages be so long, I think the natural consequence was very minimal, easy peasy boss fights. So not a huge fan of the boss fights. And then there's the progression system, which is a whole can of worms unto itself. But I'll say briefly that the progression system in the end doesn't really matter. It's one of those little bits of false depth, because once you unlock the progression system either through grinding easy mode over and over or other means, then it just kind of doesn't matter anymore. It has all these gadgets and little things to tinker around with, but in the end, just max out homing, max out missiles, just max everything out, and all the rest of it kind of doesn't matter. It's just something there to twiddle your thumbs and look like there's a lot going on, but the way it's even constructed makes very little sense. There's this whole like pattern editor thing in there, all these types of things in there that aren't communicated really well. But then there's decisions that they make that I was like, oh, maybe this is kind of a good idea, but even there are huge problems. For example, you can go in and you can change what shot pattern you use, but then they make this insane decision to tie what shot pattern you use to your shield bar. Why? I can't even get under the logic of this, because there's one stage 2, the opener, where you've got all the little spider tanks on the side. That is like the one part of the game where you're like, I may need to switch shot type here so you can get the wide shot and hit the things on the sides. But then your shot is tied to your shield. And then what ends up happening is there's all this chaos, things are blowing up, you're using shield items and all this sort of stuff. And so you're like constantly trying to juggle back to wide, and it's like, screw it. So if they had just made it simpler, it would have actually been somewhat useful. If they said, okay, you get 3 loadouts, you can press Y and it's wide, you press Y, it's narrow, press Y again and it's like kind of in between or whatever. That would have been something. But instead, making it just even more chaotic and weird by tying it to your shield level kind of shuts down even that little bit of utility. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about the progression system too much other than just maxing it out, right? And let's get to my final thoughts. Cygni has been a weird experience for me, and I think the 2 fundamental flaws of this game that I was talking to them back years ago that is just built over the past 2 years is that the game does not have a coherent vision and that the game is not refined. And not being a traditional shmup is not a coherent vision, okay? Erase the genre distinctions, erase genre. What is this? There are examples you guys could look to of games that have taken hardcore genre concepts and translated them into a more mainstream framework. My favorite example is Devil Daggers. I don't know if people know this, but Devil Daggers was highly inspired by Sin and Punishment, an arcade-style rail shooter. And what that developer did is, okay, how do we take these sort of Sin and Punishment, rail shooter, shmup, bullet hell concepts and then translate them into a popular FPS framework? Look at Devil Daggers. Devil Daggers does it beautifully and in a way that's innovative and inspiring to this day. There's stuff I've seen Devil Daggers that arcade games haven't even caught up with its leaderboard system and with like its infinitely looping ending kill screen type of thing that it does. Devil Daggers takes a lot of the foundations of great arcade design, great genre design and then extends it into this unique style that's never been seen before and is actually now influencing other games. That's reinventing a genre. If you want to innovate and reinvent a genre, that foundation needs to be so solid that other developers look at your game and say, yes, I want to copy that. I want to learn from that. That is not going to happen with Cygni. I'll tell you that right now. Everything about this game's design is a compromise, and ironically, that kind of makes Cygni more traditional than I think the developers intended. Cygni, in a lot of ways, is kind of a traditional shmup, but it's just one that's making all these weird compromises constantly to the point where it's just a mess. It's just duct taped together. Everything about this game just is all over the place. It is crazy how disconnected the parts of this game are and how that wasn't brought up or established in any way. And then they can kind of backshift that to game reviewers and say, oh yeah, we know what the traditional formula is, and we're ignoring it. We're going against it. We're making these bold, creative decisions not to do what the genre predispositions are. But genre conventions are not like religion or like a view system. It's not like something you believe or don't believe. I think people really need to understand this. When I say Euro shmup design in these areas is bad and doesn't work, it's not because I have these beliefs in my heart of this is how it should be in some kind of fundamental principle. Think about it more like architecture, where if I tell you, hey, if you're building a bridge this long, you need this many support beams. It's not because I fundamentally believe in support beams having to be there because of this viewpoint. It's because if you don't put the support beams there, it's gonna collapse in on itself. It isn't this bold, subversive, meta discussion around the genre. The subversive, bold meta discussion around shmups has already taken place hundreds of times. There's so many games out there that do this that shmup fans completely love, that completely accept. It's not that you can't subvert genre trends or change genre trends. And in fact, some of that is what gives your game individual identity. Rank subverts genre trends like crazy. Like probably one of the most subversive shmups of all time is Battle Gorega. Gorega flips a lot of genre trends and genre concepts intentionally, knowingly, constantly into this new cool coherent structure. And it is beloved by shmup fans. It's considered by many and myself one of the greatest shmups of all time. So this whole concept that the criticism of this game from shmup fans is purely just this fundamental, we don't like. I'm sure there's some of that, but there is a deeper thing here going on, just foundationally. And so if I want to kind of conclude with a lesson here about Cygni and about this kind of idea of shmups breaking into the mainstream and being this renaissance because of this big commercial shmup, I think what people need to understand is that for that to happen, it's not impossible for that to happen, but for that to happen, the person working on that project needs to be prepared. You need to know what you're going to do in very vivid detail before you even get the deal. You need to have meticulously planned out what this game's going to look like. You need to have a history of making good games. You need to be prepared. And you can't learn on the job at this scale. So if Cygni was done right, in my opinion, Cygni should have come in and a lot of this should have been prototyped before Konami. Because otherwise things are just going to snowball into a hot mess. And so it makes me sad to be this critical of Cygni. I wish it turned out a little bit better, but I have to be honest. And thinking of this studio's future, is it better for them in the long run to just read a bunch of yes men saying, yes, 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 you're brilliant? Or maybe having some more real feedback for their next project. They'll know, all right, we kind of tripped up on this with Cygni, but this time around, we're not going to trip up. So anyway, thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this review, also check out my review of a peer of Cygni, Devil Blade Reboot, which I think is a much more solid, well-made, but crowd-pleasing shmup that I think a lot of people could get into the genre for. Unfortunately, it basically had no marketing, but I definitely recommend checking it out. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 patrons: 100 Gamer, Abs Conditus, Accepting Panda, Anhold, AJA, Alistair Stevenson, Alexander Pfeiffer, Analgesic Productions, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Air Viper, Awu Alai, Autonamed, Beelit, Beampit, Bo, Beatodames, Blade Symphony, Boghog, Board Besmati, Borky22, Chase Palumbo, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Clara Cliff, Clay A Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Cooksan 666, Cook Some Soup, Crump 12, Des Audio, DRK, Dances with Incels, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Andrus, David Crespo, Delta Tango 6, Demian Smirnov, Dingo, DJ 420, Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Elvin Senisev, Eleanor Moon, Elias Alonso, Eric Houdini, Evie Zerker, F Deluxe, Friskin, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Soup, Game Boy Guru, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hans Kowalski, Rune Khan, Hausu, Hirudeath, Hikihime, Han Harthy, Hud, Hugh Mungus, J-Dab, Jake Ryan, Jack Walsh, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, J-Lab, JB RPG, Jin Cons, John Kelly, John Longwalker, Josh Mayer, Julian Elwood, Jurgen, K, K2, Contain, Praise the Boys, Ludwa, Lord Harrington, Lorian, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Mario Simic, Mark Sloan, Mars Bar, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Minong, Meister, New Jam, Milos Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Morog, Monroe, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Neon Dagger Games, Nile Aegiatis, Oklagoogles, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Parole, Pedro Perez, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Ralph Trujillo, Raul VP, Rapido, Realstein, Rent Halt's Time, Retrojet, Retro Man, Retro Schmupper, Riff Mason, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Ryan Bartlett, Salmon Connections, Scanline City, Jantak, Jazzy, Shmup Junkie, Shmup Run, Zerapong, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steppable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Tim French, Travis Arbon, Troop Good Guy, Sugumo, 2YU, Twest Please, Twilight EX, Unikoi Roots, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Wabby Legs, What Is This, Zachary Patton, Zeal, Zen Ryoku.